So next up, I would like to introduce Dr. Ken Binmoeller. So he's the chief of California Pacific Medical Center. He'll be talking about Hot Axios for one-step EUS intervention. Thank you, Ken.
Okay, fantastic. Well, what is Hot Axios? You know, it's become a buzzword. We talk about Hot Axios. Well, the term Hot Axios really derives from the fact that initially, when Axios was developed, we couldn't get the FDA to approve the electrocautery enhancement, and therefore we could only use the cold Axios. So we referred to the Hot Axios. Of course, with electrocautery enhancement, that enhancement, by the way, are these micro wires that run radially distributed along the nose cone, the bougie-shaped nose cone. But really more important than the electrocautery component is the delivery handle. It is a one puncture with one device platform. We call it one step, but actually there are multiple steps, in fact 4 steps that I'll show you that we use. So I don't like the term one step, but it is one device, one puncture. And it is endoscopist controlled. I think that's also very important. So I want to spend a few minutes just talking about the handle because I'm very proud of this handle. I invested a lot of time with our engineers at Xlumina to develop this handle and to make it as safe as possible. And we always refer to a handle for Dr. All-Thumbs. So if you're flustered and confused, you just can follow the 4 steps that are on the handle itself. And I'm actually amazed that this is the original molding, the 3D mold that we conceived, and really the final product, even after Boston acquired this from Xlumina, looks the same. So I guess that speaks for itself, that it really has not required additional modifications. So the handle has, first of all, 2 hubs. There's a black and a gray hub. So you see these here. Now the black advances and retracts the sheath. I put that in quotes because technically speaking, that's not really what happens. The black hub is advancing the inner catheter, but if it's locked to the gray hub, then it advances everything as a unit. And the gray hub is what deploys the flanges in 2 steps. So there are 2 locks for the black hub and the gray hub. And we added a yellow safety pin because it's so important that that gray hub is locked when you advance everything forward. If it's not locked, then you're going to deploy the flange accidentally. And there are 4 steps now. And so we put those 4 steps directly on the handle so that if you get confused or lost, just look at the numbers. So the first step here, and you can see it's pointed, the arrow's pointed downwards. We advance the black to puncture, to thrust through the 2 walls into our cavity. Number 2, we retract the gray. So you can see here, number 2, we retract the gray to deploy the distal flange. Then we retract the black to snug up. So we're down to 3. So 1, 2, 3. Retract the black to snug up to the wall. This arrow is pointed upwards. And then finally, 4, again the arrow upwards, retract the gray to deploy the proximal flange. Now you're always unlocking and locking, you're alternating. So you have to always think about that because the locks are key to safe deployment. So that gray lock is what keeps the sheath and the inner catheter coupled. That allows you, when you advance your black hub, to advance the sheath with the inner catheter as a unit into your target. And it allows the black hub to retract the deployed distal flange to the wall without accidentally deploying the proximal flange. Now the black lock is what prevents any movement of the inner catheter that's attached to the nose cone in the tray that houses the compressed lambs, the Axios, during flange deployment. So we have a 2-stage release of the distal and the proximal flanges completely independent of one another. And that's really so critical to make sure that these two steps are completely separate. In fact, we added this AutoLock. You don't even have to think about locking. It is going to AutoLock. When you retract this gray hub to deploy the distal flange in your target by just pulling back here, it auto-locks and there's an audible click. So you know it is locked. And then you deploy your proximal flange in the next step here, which is the flange that deploys in the bowl. And you just pull it back and then it fully deploys. Usually we do that in the working channel, and then we have to depress this gray hub a little bit to advance it out of the working channel. Now what's very critical is this step 3, which is the snug up step. So we just think about proximal, distal flange, proximal flange release, but don't forget step 3, which is shown here, which retracts the black hub, that is to say the distal flange, to snug up against the wall of your target cavity. If you ever get lost, just look for the black band marker. What's that? It's seen endoscopically on ultrasound and on fluoroscopy, the black band. So you can see on the catheter sheath, it's here at the distal tip, a black band. So you can see this, of course, endoscopically. You know that this is where you need to start to deploy your proximal flange in the bowel lumen. On ultrasound, you see this black band as well. It is seen as black relative to the more echogenic sheath here. And then on fluoroscopy, it's radio opaque, so you can see that black band on fluoroscopy. So you have multiple modalities, imaging modalities, and that's what endoscopy is about. It's a multi-imaging integration of all of these modalities so that you know always where the tip of your sheath is. I'm going to share very quickly now 4 tips. You need to know your target, the lumen size and its contents, and the interposed tissue distance and the vessels. This is not unique to Axios. All of the lambs out there that are being developed, they all would benefit from these tips. So lumen size means that the minimum diameter of your target has to be greater than the flange diameter. So here is the saddle diameter, and the flange diameter should be 1.5 to 2 times the saddle diameter. Or I should say the flange is 1.5 to 2 times the saddle diameter. And therefore, when you estimate how long the trajectory should be, it has to be longer than the total flange diameter. And you would ideally always want to have your target lengthwise in the trajectory of your puncture, just as you can see here, especially if you're targeting the small bowel to perform a gastroenterostomy. The lumen contents, there should be sufficient pocket of liquid for distal flange deployment. You should avoid thermal contact with any solid shadowing content because the calcium absorbs current, and select an axial size that's proportionate to the contents requiring drainage. One trick that I use a lot is to pre-infuse saline, hook up a 19-gauge FNA needle, prime it with saline, you don't want to introduce any gas, hook it up to a water pump after entry, instill saline until the desired lumen size or contents is reached. And so you can see that in the diagram, how we hook up our syringe after priming the FNA needle to fill the lumen with saline. Measure the interposed tissue distance and vessels. It should be greater than 10 millimeters in the trajectory if you're using a 10 millimeter saddle. Here you can see an interposed vessel, so don't forget to Doppler. Tip 2 is know your cautery. You should use pure cutting current you can increase the voltage for a thick wall or fibrotic wall for difficult penetration. Advance your catheter slowly with steady pressure. I call it the 3 S's. Slow, steady, and smooth. Stop and retract if there's interposed gas that impairs your ultrasound view. Look for bubbles upon target entry. As soon as you see those bubbles, the bubbles are generated by fluid with diathermic contact. You stop advancement immediately. And don't forget to disconnect the cautery cable
immediately after target entry. This is what can happen if you advance too far. You can go through the opposite wall. This is the gallbladder. I perforated. Fortunately, I was able to place a single clip and close that perforation, but you don't want to perforate through the opposite wall. Tip number 3 is know when to preload a guide wire in the delivery system, right? So it's advanced to the tip. You're not placing a guide wire first. You're going freestyle, but as soon as you're in the target, you advance your wire out. It's a safety net to retain access. It will deflect the nose cone away from the opposite wall if you have tight spaces, and it will orient the direction of the distal flange deployment. So take advantage of using that guide wire and thinking about that beforehand. And finally, this is the most important, you need to know how to manage maldeployment. So most common are the type 1 maldeployments where that distal flange deploys between the target and the bowel wall. And it's called a type 1. It's in about 2/3 of the cases. I distinguish between 1A and 1B. 1A is when the proximal flange is not yet deployed. You can resheath the distal flange then, and you can start over. Type 1B is when you've deployed the proximal flange, well, then you have no choice but to remove the Axios with a rat tooth forceps. Type 2 is in about 1/3 of the cases. This is where you have 2 types. Again, if you were smart and you placed a guide wire ahead of time, then you can immediately insert a second stent. It could be a SEMS, it could be a second Axios, and you can salvage the situation. Now, if you didn't place the guide wire as a safety line, then you have no choice. You have to remove the Axios and just pray that that enterotomy, that's because you were in the target, but the distal flange slipped out of the target, that's the type 2, you just pray that you're not going to get continued leakage through the enterotomy here or the hole in your target. And because you use cautery, that hole may not close. When you have a type 3, so that's where the proximal flange deploys outside of the bowel wall, well, that's where you call the surgeon and you beg them to save your behind because that's when you're in trouble. You're going to absolutely have to send this patient to surgery. You can resheath the distal flange. It's very simple. There's a latch here. You just have to push in the latch. You have to relock your gray hub and just advance the gray hub forward. That will resheath if you want to do that. And finally, you must close that hole and you must do it robustly. I use the over-the-scope clamp, call it a clamp, not a clip, because that is the most secure way to close that hole. Remember, primum non nocere, first do no harm. These high surgical risk patients who benefit the most from endoscopy, these are also the ones that fare the worst if they have a complication from your procedure and require emergency surgery. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Any questions? So, Ken, what do you envision the next steps for Axios?
Top secret. I'm actually very proud that because it really is about the safety. And so anything we can do to make this safer for the patient, absolutely. And I really invite all of the device companies, all of them, and there's no paucity of companies here in Korea with such great innovative power and intent. And so I invite all of these companies to think about how can we make this safer for our patients? How can we make it quicker for the endoscopists? And most importantly now, because this is the reality of our time, cheaper.
Okay, thank you, Ken.